Okay, okay. Hi, I just wanted to welcome all of you at the Speed Art Museum. I'm Rafaela Plato, I'm the executive director here, and it's such a pleasure to have you on this beautiful Sunday for a special talk with Vian Sora, a just remarkable artist who has for quite some years called Louisville home. And she is one of these incredible artists who've worked and practiced for a very long time, started as with a figurative practice and then moved onwards towards abstraction. But even her abstraction is infused with figures and mythologies and stories of her home region and home country, Iran. So Vian has lived through some traumatic events of dislocation and really thinking through very hard what home means. And she's here today to give us deeper insight into her artistic journey and into her private journey. And it's just a tremendous honor to have her here. As an organization, we are increasing our focus on artists who call Louisville and Kentucky home. It's an area that is very important to us, and we want to be the institution that supports and celebrates artists from the region. So in the past 2 years, we have done some additional acquisition of artists from the region, mounted exhibitions. There's also a beautiful exhibition right now on the second floor of the late artist Bob Douglas. And I encourage you not to miss the exhibition. He is an artist who unfortunately passed away just several months ago. And he is a pivotal artist coming out of the Louisville workshop, like a critically important artist group of Black artists here in Louisville who worked in the 50s and 60s. So there's lots to discover here at the Speed of how artists here at home contribute to the larger discourse of what art and culture is. And I want to welcome Tyler, our curator of contemporary art, to give a more detailed intro. And then we'll delve right in with Vian. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Of course, we're here with our Starbucks. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm thrilled to be here with Vian, who has become a fast friend. I've been at the Speed just for about over a year now. And Vian, I was thrilled to learn that Vian was living in Louisville. I knew of her paintings before I came here, so it was just totally wonderful to find out that she called Louisville home. So a bit more officially, the printer was not working, so I'm going to read a little bit from here. I'm catching my breath.
Because he got me coffee.
So as Rafaela mentioned, my name is Tyler Blackwell. I'm the curator of contemporary art here at the Speed. And we are so thrilled that all of you took the opportunity to come out on this sort of muggy day, Sunday afternoon, to spend here inside the museum. It's really wonderful just walking to my office and back now to see so many people here on our free Sundays. And that's something that we hope to continue and enhance in the coming months. And I'm thrilled that the museum is presenting its 5th annual Alan Mary Shands Master Artist Series lecture. Previous invitees have included artist luminaries such as Alison Schatz, Noel W. Anderson, Wolfgang Buttress, and Ebony G. Patterson. Vian is the 5th artist to participate in this series. And this year we are, I've said this, we are thrilled to welcome our hometown artist, one of our hometown artists, Vian Sora. Vian who's an artist whose work is already in the Speed's collection, a permanent collection, before I arrived here. Her work is also on view still to coincide with this lecture as part of Rounding the Circle, the Mary Nell Shands art collection, which is on view at the opposite end of the building. There was a section that was on the third floor, but now it was divided into two parts. And so the latter part, which features contemporary artists who are primarily local to the area and to the region. Vian's work is still on view. So if you've never seen Vian's painting in person, then I would invite you to spend some time with it today. Today is the last day, the very last day. And then, of course, this work will also, as part of Mary Nell Shand's sort of remarkable bequest, as you all may know, of over 177 contemporary artworks that were many were on view here, but many of those works are going to make their way into the Speed's permanent collection. So shortly, the Speed will be the home of two Vian Sora masterworks, which is really thrilling for us. Vian Sora's work mines history and her own life and her lived experiences as a source of contemplation and imagery. She's lived several lives, I think we can say, which we will hear about today, and these often dramatic and intense periods have informed the person she is, as well as the complex, richly layered artworks that she creates in her Louisville studio, which overlooks the Ohio River. At the heart of Vian's practice is a desire to illuminate the sometimes violent stories of her life, her family, and her community in Iraq, as a way to invite all of us to think about our own humanity and our place and our privilege in the world. Vian's paintings sometimes depict war scenes, figures, and landscapes that inhabit her visions of the places she's been and the people she knows. Vian was born in 1976 in Baghdad. She studied printmaking in Istanbul in the mid-2000s after she received a bachelor's degree in Baghdad in computer science in the year 2000. She's had solo exhibitions in Baghdad, Istanbul, Kuwait City, and Dubai before she moved to the United States. Since she moved to Louisville, she has had several exhibitions here in the city, including presentations at Quappy Projects, 1619 Flux, Mormon Gallery, and others. She has been included in group presentations here at the Speed, the Contemporary Art Center in Cincinnati, and the KMAC Art Museum. She is currently represented by Luis de Jesus in Los Angeles, which is particularly wonderful whenever a Louisville artist has representation outside of our city. She has shown work at Luis's gallery in solo and group presentations. Her work is included in the permanent collection here at the Speed, as well as the Pizzuti collection in Columbus, the KMAC Museum collection, the Grinnell College Museum of Art collection, which is in Iowa, and many private collections across the world. Excitingly, her work was recently acquired by the Santa Barbara Museum of Art and the Baltimore Museum of Art. So we are catching, I think, Vian at a moment of growth, both here at home and nationally, internationally. So we are thrilled, as I have said, as Raphael has said, we are thrilled that Vian agreed to do this chat with us. So we're just going to talk. This is going to be a very loose presentation. Vian and I are going to be in conversation, and we have a lot of slides sort of telling Vian's story from the time in which I think you began to think of yourself as an artist, and the sort of different experiences that you have lived through, both in the Middle East and here in Louisville. And so we're just going to launch right into it, and then there will be a period at the end, if good with you, where we will ask some questions for you, to you, of you. Yeah. Uh-oh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks,
Yeah,
Rafaela.
do you want to say anything? Well,
Yeah,
I'm talking a
thank
lot
you.
already.
Thank you. Thanks, Rafaela. Thanks for the Speed for having me. And I guess let's dive in because we have a lot of slides.
We have a lot of slides. Just some information. I mentioned Vian was born in 1976, and of course I'm going to be doing a lot of talking, but we are here to hear from Vian. So you please have to lead us through.
Okay.
But these are just some like highlight points. I don't think we need to talk about every single element. I mean, I wanted to ask, you see here that you had a degree in computer science, which I think is fascinating. And then when you moved here, you got an MBA.
Well, I always avoided art school in Iraq and, tried to impress my parents because, in Iraq, it's like kind of in that time, it was frowned upon to be a female painter. It's like a place where mainly male artists kind of thrive, and you should be a doctor, lawyer, or an engineer. And I had an obsession with mathematics and drawing early on. So I diverted myself from that path, but also started painting when I was studying computer science. And kind of my decision to get that degree was basically based on economic reasons, because the year before I graduated, my dad was, persecuted and tortured by Al Ba'ath Party. And for 4 months, we thought he's executed and somebody need to make money. So kind of it was a decision that's based also on economy.
So then maybe, we're jumping right into it. I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about, just give us an overview. I mean, you grew up in Baghdad, and can you just walk us through a little bit of what it was like to grow up in Baghdad, and then maybe the sort of different things that your family encountered, including, the first Gulf War, and subsequent incidents across Iraq and across the Middle East that led to a sort of early formation of how you engage with the world around you.
Okay, so I was born in Baghdad and I was 3 years old when the Iraqi-Iranian war started. So that pretty much set up the tone for the next 8 years of my life. And often we were my family was my parents trying to protect us, me and my siblings. So they would take us outside of Iraq at some point, but then we couldn't leave. It was, for Iraqis, it was impossible to leave even Baghdad. So pretty much the childhood part of that, the scary part of that was witnessing all the bombing. Bombing explosion informed a big deal of my life, but also these domestic kind of moments of protection and love that was provided by family. But at the same time, we come from a very mixed family. My dad is Kurdish from the north of Iraq, and my mother is Shia Arab, which is, in the time of Saddam Hussein, that was like being, a gay Jew in Germany. At that time, it was kind of a taboo to have that combination, to be immediately under surveillance that would pretty much last through the whole years that we lived in Iraq until the Gulf War, the second Gulf War in 2003, when Saddam Hussein was toppled. My mother's family owned a big auction in Baghdad that's where the art, and first years of art for me kind of been informed. So I was always surrounded by pioneer Iraqi artists. This is something, so this symbol is the martyr kind of monument in Baghdad. It was built in the early 80s by Ismail Fattah al-Turk. He's a very big pioneer artist in Iraq, and he was commissioned by Saddam Hussein to build it. It was a symbol of fear and awe for me because it represents a giant dome, a giant mosque kind of split in half, and below it there are waterfalls. You can't see them inside the building. And pretty much in the 80s, while we are being bombed and suffering, and basically everybody suffered with, even there was a lack of food as well, Saddam was building these monuments to glorify his existence. And it kind of started representing for me the early elements of fear, but also there was admiration, but not for, basically for him and why they were built, for the actual daring elements, and it was a fear element. So some of my paintings would have that symbol kind of demystified and deconstructed and going back into the mosques. That area that between 2000 and 2002, I built a lot of destroyed mosques, which something that happened later when ISIS took over a lot of the parts of Iraq. So
these became, I mean, in addition to the sort of images that you saw and the things that were present, I mean, these became sort of visual motifs that would then inform later images that sort of inhabit your head, your mind, your mind's eye, and then they would make their way into paintings.
Exactly. So the next one is, and there are many examples, but I try to be brief with the slides a little bit. This is Mansour University, which is probably, it's a 1,000-year-old building that was built in the time of the Abbasid, and probably the only one out of 3 buildings that survived the sacking of Baghdad by the Mongols. And I visited this many times. And it became a symbol of resistance and architecture for me. So I started using that in my early paintings. That I have very bad examples in the next slides because these are undigitized images of my early work that had this mystique and kind of this fogginess. Of course, it doesn't look as bad in reality, but you could see these I started this new technique that was rejected in the beginning. Then all these male artists later who came to my exhibition started copying it because they rejected me because I didn't have academic degree. But then it became very successful because I wanted to engrave on the canvas, and I developed something like a leather material that could stay for hundreds of years after you apply the oils and the linseed oil to it. So these are the early works that kind of led into the new work, obviously. And it was all, you could trace it. There are symbols of ancient Mesopotamian kind of jewelry. I was obsessed with peasant women because every time we visited my grandparents in Suleymania, which is north of Iraq, which is the Kurdish region, we would go through this landscape from Baghdad to north, and you see how the visuals, the nature and costumes, and even the demeanor of the peasants, especially with female peasants, changing. So they became my early heroes, these females who were taking care of the family and the cattle outside of cities, because I lived in a very cosmopolitan city, and you leave 15 minutes outside of Baghdad and you start seeing these scenes. So that's that painting. Okay.
And then there were early opportunities as you were. I mean, we see here in these works that there are elements that are recognizable. There are figures, there are women that are from the world. They're images from the world that you have translated into this early visual vocabulary that you had started thinking about for yourself. And then so there were early sort of opportunities for you to show some of these works, like here.
Yeah. So this is actually the first catalog I had in my life. It was 2001. Again, this is a print from a destroyed paper. And it was at Nationalgalerie in Baghdad, and that was in 2001, I believe. Is it? Yeah, 2001. And I had one of my favorite pioneer Iraqi artists write the text for that. His name is Nouri Rawi. He died a long time ago, and this is one of his paintings. And kind of that set up the tone for my practice, because I started these paintings that was engraved on the canvas, and I started borrowing from art history, obviously, and ancient Iraq, and because history was written on walls mainly, and I started mimicking that kind of practice, but make it into a modern day Iraq, or anything that I was exposed to. So that exhibit pretty much had that technique, which I don't have the photos of because they were lost in my studio in Baghdad.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
This is another one of a scene. Actually, this is one of my first abstract paintings that represented a scene that I saw on the Tigris in Mosul, which later I saw a scene when ISIS destroyed Mosul, and it was pretty much looking like this. And at that time, I was deciphering kind of that scene from where I am, because it was a 3,000-year-old castle and a mosque that was built over it. And I was just thinking about the change, the forced change, the religious persecution, and how the landscape changed because of that, not knowing that in 2011 the same thing will take place. And this is the only painting that I actually have from that exhibition here in Louisville.
And I think, I mean, you say it's your first abstract painting. I mean, I think it's worth, that's interesting to think about, because we see sort of the elements that then have become relatively common in your practice today, which we'll see many examples of shortly, but this sort of notion of these color fields and these geometric shapes that provide the ground for memory, action, like sort of exchange to happen on top of them. So it's like a landscape that is a landscape of like planes, of color fields, of like sort of I'm just interpreting this on the spot, everyone. Raw sort of color that then becomes a site for things to happen.
Exactly. And also I'm obsessed with the concept of decay and regrowth on top of decay, which still carries itself into my work. And this is.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, we see this work is from 2001. We see this work is from 2001, and then obviously September 11th happens here in the United States, and then everything sort of changes and accelerates in many different ways in the Middle East, and then eventually in Iraq. And so we see that this exhibition is in 2003 in Turkey, but I wonder if you want to just mention how life changed post 9/11.
So basically, if I want to tell just a brief thing about this, I will have to sit here for 6 hours, and I'm going to try to summarize between 2001 and 3 and after, when the invasion or liberation, however you want to consider it, happened in 2003, the Gulf War, the second Gulf War. We were in Baghdad, and at that point, our family is under surveillance for multiple of reasons, including my dad. So we were plotting to escape anyway, and that scene, I mean, we were in the middle of this. Our neighborhood is on the right side, Alte. So we thought, after the atrocities that happened, and going back to Baghdad from the villages that we escaped to, and the toppling of Saddam Hussein, we had hope that Iraq will be in good shape later. And I basically created that exhibition. I was sponsored by a Danish company called Grundfos to have a show in Baghdad, in Istanbul, and in Copenhagen. And the exhibit that happened later in Istanbul, in Topkapi Saray, was the biggest production for that. And I completed all the works while the bombing is happening, and then going back to Baghdad later, and basically destroyed Baghdad, where the smoke is still, blowing for months, with no electricity, and I did all the works for that. And then later we created everything and went to Istanbul and did that exhibit. So I was supposed to remain in Istanbul because my career was taken up there, but then I decided to go back because I thought there was going to be like a renaissance. This is one of the paintings, and you could tell how primitive it is because literally we were being bombed and I was trying to work. So I thought I need to go back to Iraq from Istanbul and be part of the renaissance that's going to happen. So, and to finish a book that I was writing about being a female Kurdish artist living in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So I joined the Associated Press, which pretty much informed the later traumas that happened. All these images are taken by me in the same day. I was in the car when that bombing happened. We were covering the middle bombing because my job was to go take the cruise. So
two things. I wonder, so tell us why, just for those of us who are not familiar with your story, tell us why your family and your father was being persecuted, watched.
Well, him being Kurdish merchant, he owned a gallery there, and in
Baghdad.
In Baghdad. In 1993, after the first Gulf War, and after Saddam there was an embargo, all the sanctions that happened against Iraq. Saddam was left to be, he was like a crazy dog in a corner, so he took it out on the people. So every summer, he round up people from different ethnicities, especially like from my ethnicity, let's say, and just execute them randomly in Baghdad or just throw them in prison. And that's what happened to my dad randomly. And he only left because he bribed the guy who was torturing him. Sorry, this is too dramatic, but you asked for it. So he never did anything wrong. He was just a random person to be added to a roster of different ethnicities to be taken that day. And from that day on, he tried to escape Iraq and take us out, but he never could. So in essence, in 2003, we were somehow saved by an invasion, but also it led to other things.
Right. And then so as you're thinking about coming back to Baghdad, you say you joined the AP, so you were working as a photographer, right?
No, I started as a coordinator and then a producer, then any job. People kept dying and getting killed, and I was the only female there who spoke English. So, basically you do any job. So, that day I actually had to take the crew to an explosion scene, and that was in 2004, actually, in the summer, where there was one bomb, and then when people arrived to clean up the second scene, there was another one. And pretty much my life between 2003 and 2006 until I left Iraq to Turkey, because that's where I immigrated later, it was informed by bombing. And that's when what you call here sectarian, it was not, it was terrorism against Iraqis, because truly Iraqis paid the price for it. And that it was informed by that. And it was just very brutal, and so this is another example. That balcony, I have about 60-something photos of that balcony. That's my office in Baghdad. Right across from it is the Green Zone. And there are bombings every day until they actually finally got to our office and bombed us, and a lot of people died. And after that, it was just pretty much so dangerous to stay there. But I only left because I married an American man from here and got married in Turkey. So those scenes informed the next body of work. And this is a work that was included I created in Istanbul after I moved there in 2006, in the spring of 2006. And I was just trying to memorize and kind of save in my own head the identity of Iraq and my identity. So I started creating all these very kind of dramatic scenes of Mesopotamian reliefs that are destroyed by the war, or they are moved or borrowed or stolen to other museums like the Pergamon in Berlin. So then actually, funnily, this was sold later to a collector in Kuwait City who, and I will talk about that exhibition later. So this is the kind of work I started doing when I was in Turkey for my next exhibitions. And this is Doors of Patience.
So you made your way out of Iraq. Mm-hmm. Can you
Yes.
talk about that process to just like, again, if we're thinking about a path, so you've experienced, now multiple existences in Baghdad, and you've left the country and come back, and now what is your journey?
Well, the journey was that I fell in love with an American who moved to Istanbul just to convince my family that, okay, he's real, he's not gonna, just flake out. Because it's, at that time, to be associated with Americans in Baghdad, it's like, hey, come kill me, it's just an invite. And it was very dangerous for myself and my family to say that publicly. So we actually lied. We said, I'm marrying a Turkish man. And Istanbul was the only place where I could get myself and my family, who only came for the wedding, a visa. Basically, I bribed the Turkish who was it? Ambassador in Baghdad, I gave him a painting, and he gave all my family a visa. And that time in Baghdad, everything was falling apart. I mean, you could be killed for any reason. My crew and I were targeted. Half of us got killed. And it was just impossible to stay. So on April 2nd, 2006, we left Baghdad in different cars. I took 3 bags with me, locked my studio, and went to the Turkish borders and made my way to Istanbul. But then my family went back to Iraq, and that was the next phase of immigration for them. And from Istanbul, where I stayed for a year, and we were planning to come back to America, and we're gonna get to the next slides. There were other events that took place that led into me having to stay in the Middle East and take all my family out, because my uncle, who was the deputy health minister of Iraq, was kidnapped and killed, and everybody was threatened. And I feel like this is becoming more political because, of course, it's all related to my work. So that led into me and Jed, my husband, deciding to get a job in Dubai and get everybody one by one out. Which during that time, I was invited to do an exhibit at Dar Said Museum in Kuwait, and it was a great moment of breaking boundaries and borders for me, because as an Iraqi, you could be persecuted there for being there. So I had a very successful exhibit there. I couldn't attend because I was an Iraqi citizen, so Jed, my husband, went to the opening, and then while being in Dubai, they invited me to do another exhibit the next year, and the Sabah family actually got me a visa. So I think I was one of the first Iraqis to visit Kuwait after invasion.
And so in that sense then too, you are making as much as you were able to. You were still thinking about making, and you are being invited to make exhibitions. And so your paintings, your work becomes a sort of through line through all of the trauma and intense violence that you're experiencing in these different places.
Yeah, so these years been very intensified with work, and this is actually when I studied almost for a year at the Istanbul Graphic Art Museum, printmaking, because it was just an amazing opportunity to kind of put all that interest that I had in calligraphy and mixing my calligraphy with art. So that was a very rewarding experience of working there.
And so when we say calligraphy and again these sort of nods to a traditional visual vernacular, I mean, if we look at the painting here on the left, and we've seen them in some of the other paintings so far, but for everyone looking, we see the sorts of do I have a little thing on here? Oh man. We see the sorts of mark making that happens, or that you started to think more proactively about including. And so you see the influences of those calligraphic moments that is sort of fusing, again, these sorts of stories that you're trying to tell that are not literalizations of people or places, but they're interpretations. And then so it becomes like a fusion of the things you're learning, this sort of new style of techniques, right? And also just this sort of translation of the lived experience.
Exactly, and it was just mapping the exile experience, because for me, that was an exile before it became a chosen immigration path. And then later when I went to Dubai, and I lived there for 3 years on the path of taking all our family, it kind of became more evident in the work, and that's when the work started shifting. And of course, all these paintings really look way different in real life.
We see all the marks too.
Yeah.
Again, the calligraphic marks.
Yeah.
And
So,
these are rendered. They're almost like a relief in the painting.
yes, and I'm still using
Right.
chiseling the material and applying the oil at that point. I am jumping back to Louisville because there is a lot to see. So, I don't know if you wanted to pick from that or
Let's see.
just
Leah, can you just tell us a little bit about, so just again, there are so many threads of narratives here, which is what I find fascinating about your life and your work. Can you talk about the transition from moving to the U.S.?
So it was just moving 4 countries within less than 5 years kind of imprinted it. There was a huge effect of that on my work, obviously. So before coming to the US, we lived in Dubai, and that was the beginning of the building of Dubai. And I did a lot of work that I'm not a big fan of, to be honest, because it was a reflection of the surveillance there. Because then in Dubai, they are not big fan, you cannot really paint figures because they're Sunni Muslim. And I could say that because my family is Muslim. So, it's a boundary that you cannot paint a person because it's a taboo. But all this changed. Now you could show anything in Dubai, technically. So at that time, I had to respond a little bit to that after I was warned, because in the beginning, I did a lot of work that was very figurative, and a lot of female figures, nude female figures embedded within these scenes. Because I couldn't see anything except nude female figures within landscapes because of that effect that took on women in my country. So I was warned publicly that you cannot do that. So I started shifting into more metaphorical kind of aspect of the work, which I didn't include a lot of slides of it because, again, we will be sitting here for 6 hours and not see the new work. So,
and then you eventually, you made your way.
So in 2009, we immigrated here after years of trying to get my green card, and immigrated to the U.S. in the fall. And my first show was I was invited by Gil Holland to do an exhibit at the Green Building. And I totally felt lost. It was a cultural shock, for me to move here in the beginning. And I tried to make sense of it. So.
And you moved here because Jed, your husband, is from Louisville.
Yes.
Right.
Pretty much. But also, it was at these years, and as much as the work come from a lot of trauma, obviously, but I don't want it to be about that. At that point, it was the best place to hide, and it was the best place to heal. And I couldn't deal with being in any big cities, so it was perfect for that purpose, and deal with PTSD and other things. But also, it was very traumatizing in the beginning, and I couldn't know where I am. Why there is no light in the streets, for example, so that
culture
also
shock.
Yeah. And it kind of reflected on the work as well. And then after that exhibit, basically the saga of trying to get my citizenship and my getting my family here.
Right, right. And so that became an ongoing. That became a new sort of journey, was this notion of trying to figure out ways in which to bring your family members who were still in the Middle East, find pathways for them to come here.
Exactly. And, finding my place. And it became, which is something I never speak about in my work, or, when there are, conversations like this. A lot of it is the new relationships and friends and people and disappointments and love and all these things coming into picture in the work. So it was a new landscape for me to kind of approach and handle within the work.
Right. And so now the slides we're looking at are, we've moved, Vian has moved to Louisville, and you're now thinking about a sort of, we see that the images here are slightly, this painting in particular is like slightly more literalized in that we can see almost, we know that we're looking at figures, we know that we're looking at animals, but then we also see elements like, this bottom left-hand corner here where there are sort of this drip elements, these sort of cloud, like non-figurative elements, the drips that become, and we still see a little bit of semblance of the sort of calligraphic marks. So your work is transitioning. and maybe this is like, thinking through what your work wants to be.
Yes, and also with this specific one, I had multiple landscapes built over each other because it was just in my head how many places that I moved within 5 years that looked completely different. And that's why I called it a place to get lost, because this is how I felt about coming here in the beginning. And obviously the very primitive figures kind of, look like very ancient Mesopotamian, even pre-Babylonian kind of era when people hardly even had any tools to engrave with. So it was just for me going back to that moment, which is the moment of myth as well, because pretty much Iraq for me at that point, I couldn't deal with that subject. And I just went back like 7,000 years ago before even art history start talking about it. So.
Right. And then, but you're still thinking through it. So this is pretty chronological. So it's interesting to think about the sort of transition. This is 2014, and then we are here in 2016. So 2 years. This is really, at least in these slides, there are other paintings that speak to this sort of transitional moment, but you really sort of start thinking about, it seems to me, like the translation of images like this that become almost fully abstract.
Yeah, and there is an event in between these two paintings that took place, is that I had a major hysterectomy and lost all my fertile organs. And the simplest thing I could say about this is that I woke up painting differently. I woke up really not caring about anything else, because I was like, okay, I could take this as a very dramatic event, a traumatic physically and mentally, but also it was somehow liberating for me to just completely be someone else in my work and just unshed that skin. And that's when I was invited by Karen Nichols to do a show that was kind of a charity show for refugees called Displaced Narratives at 1619 Flux, and created all these works. And the core work, which is in one of the images, this one, Apocalypse. So I created this basically, that was a year before the Syrian plight of refugees. The Syrians and Kurds started crossing in boats to Europe, and that's when you see these scenes of people dead on the beach because they're not allowed into Europe. So pretty much that show dealt with, refugees and, displacement, immigration, borders, why some people, because of who they are, cannot be allowed in Europe versus other people. And then also dealt with my own kind of experience, and that's the peak of me trying to get my family here and being rejected on every aspect and having to be, all the stereotypes that I dealt with as an Iraqi, as someone who is an outsider, but also there was equally love and support from people here who allowed me to stay here and feel safe. So that's when I did that work and that exhibition, and it pretty much changed my work, my next work.
Right. And so, that also is interesting to think about in the sense of the thing that often strikes me about your work and the sort of many different inspirational points that then inform how you make is that there is obviously, there are decades of literal war and death and violence, and then also, but these ideas of friendship and love and familial support and moving to new places and trying to feel at peace in your own mind and in your own body. These are all swirling around. So, you and I have joked that it is a joke. I don't want to be inside your head, because there are so many sort of points of reference that then inform and get translated into the work. And so increasingly, as we sort of now this period of post moving to the U.S. and your visual vocabulary and the way that you make paintings, it sort of moves away from the sort of literalizing figures, which we see at the top of Apocalypse here. And we see figures, and I mean, this is obviously a very traumatic scene, but then we are increasingly moving towards the abstracting of similar topics, but they are now sort of visually reduced to just be hints of those things. And so can you talk a little bit just about this notion of like what it means to make landscape violence, death, disseminating it down into these sort of forms?
Well, there are two things that I want us to speak about here, and I'm going to go back to your question. But before that and during that show, I met Shands and Julian Robson. And that's how I also started having like a kind of a community. I started getting comfortable to be in an art community, and the influences started kind of being different influences for me, if that makes sense, because previously it was very focused on my own heritage and where I lived and traveled, let's say, and pretty much European influences. And I started feeling more that I belong into more of an American landscape and part of a very segregated, interesting city. So that led into some of these themes, but then I'm still basically deciphering and trying to make sense of the landscape, because now it became my own body into the landscape. And that's when I started being okay with talking about what was the last thing, because there were a lot of traumas, but I think the explosion scenes kind of really took its toll on me, because that was something I was never able to discuss. When I arrived to a scene, and apologies for the grotesqueness, and there are just livers, hearts, arms, skin thrown everywhere of people who had families and dreams and, and trying to make sense of it all. So I started working these scenes and reversing them. I felt like that was my own, and it sounds stereotypical, but it was my own healing or making sense of them or having my own heroes and scenario that I want. So these scenes and reversing these scenes into these beginnings became my own act of resistance. And because in the end I was always very optimistic person, I mean, even with all that, I wanted to persevere through all this. So it led into scenes of decayed beauty. So this is actually, I was invited by Miranda Lash to do the Prolonged Gaze Zephyr Gallery, and I created these 7 works specifically for that. And they kind of set the tone for the next work that is The Speed and other works. So the work started changing because I also stopped following my own rules. I kind of broke my own rules for myself, and it was a very rewarding experience.
That's really interesting to think about. I don't know if I've ever heard you describe it like that, sort of reversing the scenes. That brings to mind all sort of different kinds of ideas and reference points, but this idea of trying to put things back together or revisualize or rethink what could have been, or I think that it's important to bring to bear that obviously in images in war, with death so prevalent, we're getting heavy, folks. With death so prevalent and violence so prevalent, destruction quite literally, that there, of course, are so many lives and so many ideas and dreams, like you mentioned, families and memories. All those things, are become changed instantly. And so this notion of trying to capture some of those things and then revisualize them or translate them in a way that is your own sort of coming to terms with and or trying to figure out what you've seen is quite that makes sense to me now, knowing your work a little bit, but gosh, that's like that stops me a little bit. And And so as you became more entrenched in Louisville, I think it's very important to note too that like your comfortability, your sort of relationships with friends and with your family eventually makes their way to Louisville.
Finally. Still working on one to settle. But it's, did you finish or you
No,
have a
go
question?
ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, there was more kind of slowly, I'm not coming to terms, but settling and, determined on finding moments of joy, which is really kind of it's making its way into the work, although the destruction and death and all this package is there. But also I started really enjoying being part of a community and didn't think of myself as another artist who need to escape to a big city. I wanted to belong here because how many people from my background are here and working? So I really enjoyed that idea of kind of settling here and doing the best work I could. And that's when I started showing with Mormon Gallery, and I did a few shows there. And the work later, it became a lot handling these, still doing these atmospheric landscapes that really, I didn't speak about one thing where a lot of these images started as aerial views of images I saw when I worked with the Associated Press in Baghdad. So we had these giant maps of each explosions, and they're all aerial scenes of Iraq and what's happening and where it need to be covered, where we need to send the next crew. So it became the beginning points of these paintings, but also in a way to decode and to open these kind of borders in terms of my own body, because a lot of the beginning of this process when I create these explosion scenes flat, you're familiar with my process now. It starts flat and there is a lot of heavy application of pigments and stripping and adding. It became my own way. It has my own body weight on it until the controlled process start. And it led to this work, which is in the Speed collection. And this was a direct, basically, reaction to when Trump became president, because of that time when he started the Muslim ban, or whoever, the 7 countries ban, which impacted directly my family. I mean, I had family members who were rejected visas and access to come here, and all the bigotry and racism that started later, which, I mean, I deal with it in a polite way, and the polite racism and the non-polite racism, but then also it started a different network of support for me. So I started, Echo Narcissus, because it also deals with the narcissism of megalomaniac dictators. So there you go. Last Sound is the painting that is actually at the Baltimore Museum, and it was part of Crown of Rays, which was the first triennial at KMAC. And it happened after, I was conversating with Joey Yates and started these paintings. And that's the installation view. And I'm going to get back to that painting because in a different slide. So,
Right now.
Okay. No, I was talking about the wide one.
The white one.
That one. We'll
yes.
talk about it later.
No, I was just going to say, so for those of us who are unfamiliar with your work, we see how there are sort of many different visual motifs, sort of many different strategies to making the paintings that sort of go into play. And so as you are also becoming you're becoming more entrenched again in this sort of American life, you are also becoming a more masterful, if you will, manipulator of paint. And so I just wonder if very quickly, what time is it? I'm like, we can go on forever. It's about time. If you could talk just very briefly about some of this sort of interest in, or the differences in the way that you make the paintings like this. I mean, we see the drips, we see this sort of moments of like sort of erasure, and then we see like solid, solid like swaths that are just like pure color. How do you think about sort of interpreting all of these things simultaneously?
Well, there is definitely an intuitive process, but also the control process is happening while I'm thinking about events, or that, this, for example, it was a reaction to the killing of Breonna Taylor and being here, and not to claiming any narrative, but I was my own reaction to that event. So I created Roots, and it kind of painted itself. I mean, it took 8 months to execute, just to weave this kind of human and bodily and relationship mess. But it becomes a very gratifying process for me when I control these decaying areas and create these relationships. So it pretty much paints itself, and it's not that easy,
And so we still see, I think it's fun to sort of, there's like the puzzle making that happens when you paint. We still see like little nods to figures that pop up here and there, or we see like, this is maybe not a great example of what I'm talking about, but works that are, this is a detail of the same painting. There's the face that sort of peeks through. But then we also are like maybe with Echo and Narcissus, the painting that the Speed owns, we see this sort of elements that can then be sort of interpreted as larger sort of considerations of real things. And so that is another thread throughout the work, is that you are trying to, here, quite literally, legs, arms. Talk just a little bit. I'm gonna make our way through this.
Yeah, these works started after the pandemic, obviously, and after I had COVID for the first time. And it became a reflection to that situation of being in this domestic, fearful environment for everyone, kind of unknown. So the figure somehow made its way back into the work, but I'm still trying to hide it, So it's always that struggle between figure and kind of suggestive forms. This one is another one.
And this is the painting that is on view at the museum, so go and see this afterwards. It's that way. There it is. And then we're just to show some very recent works, just to show where your work is today. I think that there is like in the last few years, there's like whereas something like this, there is like a tightness in the consideration of it's like a network of lines and marks that feels very controlled. Whereas like works like this today, in the last few years, it seems like you've allowed yourself to feel even more comfortable, and you allow for the looseness of the paint just to take over at some moments. And there's not such a prescribed way that's like a line has to end or a figure has to be exactly one thing.
I'm just happy to be with Simone Lee here. So.
Oh yeah, your work on view with Simone Lee.
This is End of Hostilities, and it was collected for KMAC by Henry Heiser, and it's part of KMAC collection. And it was from that era where I started working with it was around the time of KMAC Triennial, and it was my departure point from war, Iraq, all these events that took place in my life. So that's why, if you see it in person, it looks different than the photo.
I want to see it in person. Joey, let's make that happen. You had a residency in Berlin that was quite formative. That I think it's worthwhile just to sort of talk very briefly about the sort of ideas of what it means to be in certain space. This is your current studio, which has the view of the Ohio River, which was important for you to have this view of like this sort of transitional point in an underground railroad. But if you want to just briefly talk about like the importance of place to making.
Well, somehow, just really quick about Berlin. Berlin is one of my favorite cities and is a place where a lot of immigrants face their trauma. It's a place that repel you or sucks you in. And that was my second time there. I mean, I've been to Germany about 8 times, and Berlin is always that place that I gravitate towards, besides it's being a center of the arts in Europe. And I was supported by the Great Meadows and the university there, and a friend who allowed me to use his studio. And that residency, just because there's no time to talk everything about it, it really allowed me to accept that, to separate my home studio and get an actually bigger space. And when the opportunity came to acquire this space, it was perfect. It's facing, I think this is a very traumatizing scene, especially its connection to slavery. But again, that's not a narrative I can speak about. So it kind of was a very interesting focal point for me to face. And I actually walked that day to the, is it the unknown? What is it? The project, unknown, Hannah Drake project. Forgot the name. The unknown project. So I walked from there, and I just felt the connection to, I think this is a very traumatizing river. I mean, the rivers carries that, some of the memory. So, that's my studio now, and that's where I feel like it was the best decision in terms of separating the practice from my older studio at my home. And these are the works that came from the residency as well, that was shown at Mormon Gallery later last year.
We're looking at some recent works just to show where you're at now.
This was shown at CAC, and it's part of Grinnell College collection right now. And I was driving back from Nashville after the hurricane, the tornado last year, and kind of led into the completion of that work in this way. This is why there are deflated bodies on a tree. And so it became kind of a reaction to an event and a landscape that I'm familiar with. And that was in the Kentucky part.
There's a lot to look at.
Yeah. This is an install view from last year's show at Luis de Jesus in Los Angeles. Subduction is the, it's a process of tectonic plates hitting each other, leading into disasters, But then this whole concept of regrowth and rebirth after destruction is coming into, life, into the work. So with all this kind of events, there are events that is regenerating, coming back into life, into new possibilities, and there is a lot of energy that is, happening within the work, and bigger spaces like you noted earlier. Hanging Gardens. This was a commission that is pretty much responding to a place in Texas, but I also, because it's going to be installed in Fidelity headquarters, so I studied some of the lakes there and kind of brought my own landscape from Iraq into this as well. And I'm using part of the wing of Lamassu from ancient Iraq. So it's kind of a symbol of rebirth.
Bringing some Iraq to Texas.
Iraqi Texasian detail. Barzakh is the place you go after death in ancient, actually in Islam. My mom is not here, so I can go. So it's the place you go before paradise, or before, so it was an imaginative, beautiful place, but also it's eerie and has dangerous possibilities.
And we see, the sort of marbling that is now a sort of signature in your recent paintings of the different textures. They're increasingly complex, which is just totally wonderful to look at. Your eye sort of never rests. You don't know exactly what you're looking at.
Because I want to, for me, I'm interested in keeping audience engaged. So it's you're either gonna love it or hate it. This is how it is. So it's like, okay, I can't stop looking. If you stop looking, I failed in that painting, in my opinion, So another install view of Winkel.
Well, also, to me, it speaks to this idea of things that are not fixed in your in the way that you have encountered them. It is a confluence of all of these memories and ideas and images. Yeah. It's sort of swirling around. So of course, naturally, there's not going to be like an exact thing. Everything looks like it could be moving, or it's just arrived in the picture plane.
Yeah, and it like this morphing into something else, new possibilities, new landscapes, but also, I've been really dealing with responding to a lot of the discussions about, climate change, but also I'm really kind of traumatized by what's happening in Iraq with the desertation there because of all the controlled dams by, that Turkey and Iran built to dry the land between the two rivers, basically. The rivers are drying and the ecosystem there is being destroyed. But simultaneously, you have floods in Pakistan and other places. So it's happening now. It's my own way to deal with it is to create these very, kind of futuristic landscapes for me. This is how I'm seeing things. It might not make sense, but it's having elements of earth and humans and animals all kind of merged together. There's all these biomorphic kind of mimicking that's happening here. Another one.
We included lots of images.
Oh, yeah.
This is your studio. This is the sort of way in which you were sort of constantly thinking about many things. Also, again, another example, thinking about many things at one time. You're working on many things at one time.
It's called ADHD. It's true. I mean, it's part of why this work is kind of happening in this way. I'm not interested in following something from 1 to 0. I mean, whatever. I want it to be a kind of very dynamic process that's happening simultaneously in the studio. So I don't work on one painting at the same time. I lose interest, and I feel like I'm not giving it the time to settle and decide what it wants to be. So that's why there is a lot happening at one time. And just...
I mean, feel free. So we're just going to... This is a lovely image to end on. This is Vian and the late Al Shands, who I never had the opportunity to meet, sadly. But the sort of impetus for this talk and Vian's work being on view was the late Al and Mary Shands. And this is the two of you walking towards a birthday party he threw for you.
Yeah, I mean, I have to give Natalie, who's here, some credit in that. So, yeah, it was an amazing memory a few years ago that we all shared together. And, I'm just very thankful for this.
Okay, well, thank you, Vian.
Thank you.
And thank you all for your attention. Sorry, there's just so much to talk about. We should do a whole other talk about the last 5 years of your practice.
If anybody wants to attend, good luck.
Good luck. Yeah. Megan, do we want to ask just one or two questions? I know we're...
Yeah, 2 at most. Maybe.
2 at the most. All right. Yes, ma'am. We're going to bring a microphone to you.
Would you mind talking about the evolution of the flat colors that you've been doing over the past 4 years and why you're drawn to certain ones and not others?
The flat colors started in 2016, and I feel they started as an abject and as any unresolved item I had. I mean, a personal thing or just to cheat, I should not say that. Something that I couldn't resolve in the painting sometimes, so I started seeing these areas of control that happens. And it was just very rewarding visually against all the decaying parts. So the decaying, all the parts that is kind of really not making any sense visually, they became the controlling factor for those.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. One last question.
Hi. I just wanted to first just say thank you so much for resettling in Louisville and for representing women and Middle Eastern women in particular here in Louisville. And I wanted to thank you for your contribution to the art in Louisville and internationally, because we are so lucky to have you here. But as a therapist, I know your process, and the reason why I'm so intrigued by it, to see your evolution and to be familiar with grief and trauma and your process, the way you do it, it almost seems like it's your way to process through grief and trauma and therapy and the process that you go through, and what inspires you perhaps is something that's triggering you, and how if you could just speak to, like, you alluded to how it's like your intuition, but for me, like, I feel like it's your process of recovery and the way that you do your process, how you're working through things that will never really truly evolve. And then I also, that social justice aspect to all your work, which is so lacking, I think, in a lot of art, is one thing that I really appreciate. So thank you.
Thanks, Beth. I don't know how to answer this, but I will just say, like, in terms of coming to terms with all the traumatic aspect of my work, happening through basically me, painting for me is also an act of resistance. And I know many artists would say that, but for me personally, every time that I was forced to stay away from the studio, I feel myself like I have this internal violence that happens. So I just don't see myself not being a painter ever. And that's how I think this is how I deal. I don't want to say I'm painting because of trauma and because the healings aspect of it. I always knew since I was a child that I want to be a painter. So I don't know if that answered the question, and but thank you.
Thank you again, Vian. Thanks everyone for joining us. And I hope that you, again, take the chance to go and see Vian's painting that is on view at the opposite end of the museum. And hopefully there will be more opportunities that the Speed will be working with Vian in the future. And so stay tuned for that. But thanks everyone again for being here.